Alright, so we've got 3 more for this video. There's 2 from this week, and then 1 I've just caught up on. And there was more that came out, of course, like Resident Evil and that animated one, which I'll kind of get to, but I'm kind of trying to stick to doing them like kind of 3 at a time, so hopefully those other ones are in the very near future. Quite honestly, I'm just not really in a hurry to see Resident Evil, so... but I did see these 3, so let's go into them. And of course we're going to start with House of Gucci, which is our second Ridley Scott movie of this year. Not only that, but the second Ridley Scott Adam Driver movie this year. And while I did really like The Last Duel, I wasn't in love with it the way I had hoped I would be, because it was one of my most anticipated of this and last year. But this one was also kind of just looming there, because this was one of those stories where I didn't really know it. But when I was kind of in the hype phase of the movie, I kind of Wikipedia'd everybody and kind of got the full story. So that kind of got me a bit more excited for it. But I was also trying to figure out what exactly the movie was going to cover, and if it was going to be like, kind of feel like it was building up to the murder, or if it was just going to be basically like about their empire and industry and all that, and how much was going to be like about which side. And I did kind of wonder if it was going to be more of like the crime angle and kind of have that kind of feel, even if it would kind of risk going a bit Ryan Murphy, which I think some people have already compared it to anyway. That and people confusing Gucci and Versace, which I may or may not have done before in the past. When I heard that this movie was going to exist, my first thought was, didn't Ryan Murphy already do that? And then it's like, oh wait, that was... okay. Yes, but going into this, I guess the first thing I want to bring up is the fact that Lady Gaga seems to be carving out a really nice acting career so far, because I've been one of those people before where it's like, you see like somebody that sings or does something else trying to break into an acting career, and it's like, normally that doesn't work out, and it's like, just kind of stay in your lane, and usually they're just cast for like the name value and nothing else. But after this and A Star Is Born, she's actually somebody that I'm kind of really excited to see where exactly her acting career goes, because she's definitely like born to perform, like just in general. So here she does get to kind of have another big performance, and I'd say you can definitely say there's parallels here that are hard to miss in regards to Allie in A Star Is Born, where she kind of starts low and starts kind of modest, and then she sort of marries into fame and fortune, and where obviously Allie had like her own talents and was able to get there, and even though still darkness and tragedy followed, this person obviously has much more of a sort of femme fatale vibe, and you can kind of sense that every now and then you get the sense that we're looming to something sort of ominous. There's one particular scene really early on when they're on, I think it's still their first date, where she and Adam Driver go out on a boat, and it's supposed to be this really big romantic moment. They have like their first kiss, but they're surrounded by this ominous fog. It was reminding me a lot of the big scene in A Place in the Sun, which is real, and I almost feel like that has to be intentional, because number one, obviously, if it is a reference to A Place in the Sun, it is building up like, you know, this story will be fatal to one of these people. But secondly, he mistakes her, or at least jokes with her, that she looks like Elizabeth Taylor in the opening scenes right before this. And Elizabeth Taylor, of course, is in A Place in the Sun. So even though she's not in the boat scene, I feel like that's got to be some sort of reference and kind of like a foreshadowing of sorts, which is really cool. And seeing the way they interact also at the start of this, where you would almost think people going into this not knowing where the story is headed, almost might completely buy this as some romance movie with almost kind of a classic feel, like when they're just riding around. It almost has like a Roman holiday kind of vibe or something, and just kind of seeing them go back and forth, and how she has this way of, and they switch it in this really interesting way, where when it starts off, when she meets him at the party, where she's super out of place and she doesn't even realize, like, you know, who threw the party, and she has this almost sort of poser vibe to her, where it's like you can tell she's out of her depth when she's here, but at the same time I don't know if that's the Gaga quality, but it's like, but somehow she still fits anyway. But you still get that sense that this is somebody that's feels out of place here. And what's interesting about the way they switch that is how when he more or less gets disowned by Jeremy Irons because of this, and he ends up going to work for her family. And when we see him interacting with the employees there, and how, like, even though we've seen where he comes from, he's like where she almost kind of felt out of place. He seems to just kind of naturally just kind of work himself into wherever he is. And it's like when you see him interacting with the other employees at this more modest job, you'd think he'd been there the whole time. And the way Driver's able to play both of those qualities also, where even when we see him, because he also kind of feels like he's almost out of place and out of his depth. And so like it's to where it's not really a surprise when you see that how easily he sort of leaves that whole thing after he and Jeremy Irons get into it. Which is, so that whole setup, and then some of the visuals setting up this relationship also, where we see like down the wedding aisle where like her side is completely full and his side has like two people in it. And the way it's just sort of telling this story, and it's like this in itself almost feels like it could have been the movie, but of course there is so much more story here and so much more character here, and this is like not even scratching the surface. But talking about, you know, the performances and stuff like that, obviously this is going to be one of those movies where people go into it obsessing about accents, and I know sometimes, especially in movies like this, it's impossible not to notice accents, really over the top accents. But I mean, at the same time, I'm still just really sick of people just like they literally just walk into a movie and they're already talking about accents, and then they just do that the whole time. Like there isn't a whole other movie here, and that's kind of annoying. But like I said, I guess I get it for this one because they're prominent. But I'm not enough of an accent expert, nor is really hardly any of these people that are talking about it. But so I don't like to spend too much time on that because I don't really know what constitutes a great one or a shitty one for sure. So I can sense if it's over the top. Like in Leto's case, clearly it's it's obvious, but with the others, I don't really know. I did feel like Adam Driver was kind of going in and out of his from time to time, but I think that's just another case of knowing the particular actor's voice so well. Otherwise, I may not have noticed. I don't know, but going on that though, about them being super over the top, and even though, you know, Gaga's been going around saying like she worked on it for like 6 months or something, so you would think that would mean they were intended to be perfected, but at the same time, when you actually watch the movie, where so much of it feels intentionally over the top, because because the whole story kind of has a soap opera vibe anyway, like I was talking about with the Ryan Murphy comparisons. How it almost does kind of feel something like that, and it's gonna be super campy, and they let you know early on. I feel like the sex scene is the turning point for, oh, okay, this is like this is intentionally going like super over the top and super campy, and this is the tone we're going for, is the tone that the sex scene sets up. Another scene that's very early, so like within the first 20 minutes or so. So and when you look at it's like the really over the top vibe and the way, you know, the performances have this almost soap opera quality. It is the kind of thing where it's like if this were about like a fictional family but was like the exact same movie, and maybe if like some of the actors weren't as famous, I feel like this would be a cult movie in another universe. But going on that approach, it's just a matter of if the audience is willing to just roll with that, and if the people who made it are willing to commit to it. And I guess that's what we can talk about. But the first thing, another thing I want to mention here going into this, talking about the cast in these early scenes, is looking at who we have here and the giants that we have here. And so after we have, you know, all the scenes with, you know, Adam Driver and Lady Gaga doing that whole thing, and it's setting up like it could be this romance movie of sorts, then we get our transition into the sort of power plays that are going to shape the story here, and that seems to start at this scene where we have Jeremy Irons and Al Pacino in a scene together. It almost felt like another Heat moment, where it's like, just sit Al Pacino at a table with any legend, and you're gonna have something amazing. And yeah, and obviously they had worked together on like The Merchant of Venice and stuff like that. But it's still, there's just something here that felt really special about this scene, and you could just sense like how big, like that's something I feel like is missing a lot of movies now, where people talk about like how, you know, legends are dying out and movie stars in general are dying out. So it feels like we're getting fewer and far between when we get these scenes where it's just like just seeing two people together on screen and having a scene, and how big it feels. Like it feels so. It feels like a juggernaut of a scene, and it's just the two of them, sort of having it out, and they're playing brothers on top of that. So there's like so much tension here, and Pacino's got a pretty big part, like bigger than I was expecting. I do think the movie could have benefited from more irons, but I do get from a story perspective, why he's kind of, this is getting towards the end of his screen time, but while he's here, he definitely really commands the screen in a way that a lot of movies don't seem to let him much anymore for some reason. But it's, but the idea of, you know, like getting the small parts, but then being able to make them into something so, you know, consequential to the rest of the movie is something that you'll see a lot throughout this. But yeah, we also have Jared Leto here, the very another very publicized performance from Jared Leto, who I do really like. I really get, you know, people just thinking he's a pretentious douchebag and stuff like that, and he does seem there, like, especially when you see interviews lately, there is something off. Almost like he's like programmed his responses into himself, and he just kind of seems so monotone when he talks. But he's like, so he's trying to say like, you know, everything in life is beautiful and stuff like that, but he's like, so it's like he's not in there or something. But so take that, and then what he's able to put on screen, and how completely different that is, and how like every time he's on the screen something is gonna happen, and it's like something that will have your attention, and he goes all in, and that's what Jared Leto does. He goes all in, and he certainly went all in here, and he's got a whole lot of prosthetics to back him up too. So all the things, all the recipe for like a really fun performance are all here, and he's definitely bringing something. You can debate whether it's a good performance or not. A lot of people are going to think it's super hammy, super over the top, and not in the good sense. But the thing is that I more or less like this movie, but it does have a certain kind of drabness to it, and I don't know if that's like it's. I'm sure the visuals are there also, because like when you think about a movie like this, you would think it would have, you know, like the fashion vibe of it would kind of pop off the screen in a way that would give it this sort of visual flair throughout, to where it's like the almost like and sorry if you hate this movie, but I really don't know another comparison to make. If it was more like American Hustle, as far as like how it flashed off the screen, well, and while that, you know, got annoying in American Hustle, it's still, that's like, if this movie had had more of that vibe, maybe there would have been a bit more of a, because Ridley Scott's movies kind of have that similar sort of tint to them, where it really works and stuff, like All the Money in the World and stuff like that. But here, after a while, it did feel like there was something here that was missing, that was like really engaging, and I think it's the Leto scenes that really draw attention to that, because it's like I'll be watching the movie and it'll be like, oh, this is okay. I'm kind of into this. I'm kind of into these characters, and then Leto will come on the screen, and then there's like a whole different kind of, and you could say maybe it's like he's in a different movie, which would typically be a criticism. But it's like he'll have a scene, and you'll just like, it's almost hard to believe that this performance exists in this movie, no less. And then once he's gone, it's kind of like, even if it seems like he was in a different movie, or even if it seems like this performance is so much more over the top than the others, whenever he leaves, it does feel like the movie goes back to a sort of drabness. And it's like, and then you realize those injections of life that Leto is bringing is something the movie kind of needs. So, and he's in it a lot more than I thought he would be. Like, the screen time in this is much more evenly distributed than I thought it was going to be. I kind of assumed it was going to be Gaga and Driver with everybody else kind of coming in and out, and Pacino especially I didn't realize was going to be such a big player, and have so much to work with. There's a great scene with Leto and Pacino by themselves towards the end, that escalates in a really, where when it starts off, it's like nice and quiet, and I was like, oh, this is a really nice scene, and it must have been great for the two of them to kind of play off each other, and then the scene continues to escalate in a way that I kind of wasn't expecting, and then it's like magic happens. It's very over the top soap opera like magic, but still, it's still something there. So seeing all of them kind of play off each other, and like I said, anytime, whether you feel about the performance, however you feel about the performance, whenever Leto comes in, there's definitely a bit more of a life going on, and you never quite know. It was kind of giving me Nicolas Cage vibes in the way you have no idea what choice he's gonna make next. And to kind of watch the unpredictability of the character through Leto's unpredictable performance was just really fun. So I'm really glad that was kind of threw out to me, and I think the movie needed it, quite honestly. But that's pretty much where I stand on that. There's a lot to say about Jared Leto in this movie, and I'm sure much of it has been said. So there's that. I guess you could say another thing is this is one of those movies where you're constantly asking, like when you look at the performances, but you see the setting, and you see like some of the prosthetics and stuff like that, and it's like how much of the work of the actors is the makeup and costumes versus their performances themselves. But I think for the most part, they can match up pretty well. Like, it's pretty easy to just look at Leto and say, oh, the makeup's doing most of the work for him. That's stuff that we heard from, like, criticisms we heard about Steve Carell and Foxcatcher or Depp and Black Mass. Two performances that are two of the best performances of the previous decade, to me. Like, right at the top, both of them. And so that's a criticism that I don't think goes very far when you have an actor that's willing to, or an actor that has the ability to break through that and make the character, and to almost make you forget that they're wearing prosthetics. And like Leto has unmistakable eyes, so you can always see Leto in there. But just the way he like moves around and the way he's speaking and a very very over the top accent. I was still just kind of, like, I started to feel for the character kind of a lot. Even though he's a total idiot and makes the absolute worst decisions, he's actually weirdly sympathetic. Like, it's actually pretty wild what he's able to pull off. Like, as far as, like, in Gaga's instance, or I guess even Driver's, really, you can potentially see the costumes kind of overshadowing the actor, but I don't really think that happened here. I felt like there was a good enough balance, but I could see that criticism being inevitable from somebody else. There's also, as far as like flashiness, while there isn't a lot of flashiness on the screen as far as like, color or anything like that, they do kind of bring it to life with a soundtrack that's obviously within the period that it's set. And in that case also, there are choices in the soundtrack that can be great, but there's also some that might seem a bit excessive. Not like Cruella excessive, but just like maybe a little out of place. But it still also brings some sort of life to it when it needs it. Yeah, once we get towards the kind of not so much the climax, but when the turmoil in the marriage is starting to get fueled more and more. We do get some more interesting scenes where we have... there's one scene in particular that really stood out to me that I really liked. And it's a Christmas scene with their daughter. And there's this very subtle, very petty duel going on between Driver and Gaga, where they're kind of dueling for the daughter's attention. And like when they're giving her presents and stuff like that, and that scene was kind of really working, and it was kind of this way of you could sense the tension really really building. I use the word subtle. Maybe it's not that subtle, but it's certainly petty, and that's always fun to see, especially in a movie like this. So there is that, but yeah, it still feels like throughout the whole movie though that there is something missing. Before I even went into it, I'd heard a lot of complaints about the runtime, which I can see. For the most part, I don't feel like it felt as long as it is. Maybe like in the last, 25 minutes or so. And for a 2.5 hour movie, that's a lot of movie where I felt like it flowed rather nicely. But in the last 25 minutes or so there, then you can kind of feel like, oh, there's scenes that are starting to feel like they were a long time ago. You know, that feeling. But for the most part, I don't really have too much of a problem. I do think it probably could be a much better movie if it was cut down to, 2 hours or an hour 50 or something. But the flow wasn't bothering me too much. But there is like a sense of engagement that I feel like is missing. And it's because you got all this stuff going on here where like you got the whole soap opera thing, and I know there was like people were talking about like a Shakespearean vibe. There's like kind of a Godfather vibe, like an operatic vibe. But it's and you've got betrayals and melodrama and stuff like that, and you would think that would be at least bring you something, even if just on a surface level, kind of keep you in it. But I kind of felt myself kind of going in and out occasionally. And like I said, with all the stuff that's going on here and all the character interactions, and not knowing like when people are going to turn and who is going to turn on who and all that. Like I said, if you like peruse Wikipedia articles, you know the story, but seeing kind of it all put together is it definitely feels like there should be something more there. And like I said, I don't know if a lot of that has to do with like it being visually engaging on top of the story itself. But yeah, I still wish there had been a bit more of that and a bit more of the life that we saw when Leto comes in. Like I said, that's kind of really when it shows itself, is when like Leto will leave the screen and then you'll realize like you can almost feel like a little bit of the life kind of drained out of the movie just in general. Yeah, so it is something that I'm interested to see again down the road at some point, and it'll be very interesting to see if it's as much of an awards contender as people thought it would be. It's really we'll discuss that. We got a video coming soon, when we'll do our predictions again, so we'll see where it lands there. But that'll be interesting to talk about as well in itself. So. Yeah, so I'm okay with it, but it could have. I feel like there could have been more there, which is weird to say for a movie that was like 2 hours and 37 minutes, but a bit more as far like on the engagement front. So yeah, so that's basically what that is. So let's go into 8-Bit Christmas, which I really wasn't expecting much out of because Christmas movies these days are usually just shit. Like, I can't really remember the last one that felt like, oh, this could potentially be a new classic. Maybe Arthur at Christmas, which was 10 years ago. I don't know. There might have been one since then, but if it is, I don't know. So I didn't really have any hope for this. In the fact that it was, like, straight to streaming and everything. But it started off with a very charming opening, with Neil Patrick Harris and his daughter. And it's the old thing where, like, she wants a phone and he won't give it to her. And it's like, oh, you're trying to be updated and stuff like that. But it was, funny interactions, and it has a funny punchline as it goes into the title. And then it sets up this story where we're going to be hearing a story from his perspective. And the reason I'm kind of laying the plot out like this is because I had no idea what this was when I went into. I just knew the title, I had no idea what direction it was going or what it was about or anything. But it's essentially a Christmas Story and Jingle All the Way put together. So if that appeals to you, that sounds like that could sound like it'd be an absolute nightmare, or it could also sound extremely appealing depending on who you are. But we're getting a flashback story from his perspective to the late 80s. He keeps trying to guess. It's finally confirmed it's 1988. The whole idea of the way she wants a phone is the way he wanted a Nintendo. Just first and foremost, to get this out of the way, I was getting vibes of The Wizard, the movie with Fred Savage and Christian Slater from a while back, from right around the time this movie's set. While that movie is known, at least in certain circles, it also kind of has that criticism, especially today, that it was essentially just a commercial. It was basically just a Nintendo commercial. And I could see that being the criticism for this movie also. But the difference is that, first off, this movie is quite self-aware. And secondly, I don't know how you can be a commercial for a system that's from the 80s. And third, pretty much just the way they talk about it and the way they build up the Nintendo as this mythical thing is something that I specifically remember growing up with. Like, obviously, I grew up through the '90s, but it was still there, and like there were things in this movie. There were like the feelings that the lead character was having. Were feelings that I kind of remember, and the fact that it's kind of does that in the way of A Christmas Story did for the era that it was set in. Um, so going into that, like it was the whole thing where me and my brother had the Sega, and the neighbors next door had the Nintendo, and like there's that whole thing where the mythical one is the one that you don't have. So it was like the Nintendo always seemed like this sort of other thing, like this almost mythical quality thing. Um, and the way it builds up that there's this like the whole idea. First off, it's worth noting that because the story is coming from Neil Patrick Harris's perspective as he's recalling it as a memory, the whole movie is intentionally exaggerated. Like everything is like way over the top and way big, and this whole thing where all these kids would gather around the rich kid's house, the one kid that had the Nintendo, and it was this really big event, and it was and you could get the sense that it is doing it for the purposes of comedy, but it's also like an actual setup of it's like three-fourths his story, maybe one-fourth a little bit fantasy sequence. Where like A Christmas Story had its fantasy sequences in between. This is almost like a combination of the memory and the fantasy kind of coming together. Is the vibe that the movie has, because it also kind of has. And I don't know if it's just because Steve Zahn is the dad or what, but I was getting Diary of a Wimpy Kid vibes a lot as well, which to me is kind of a compliment and a good thing because I kind of love those movies. So going into this one, there is the whole thing about it being set in the '80s. So what it was that made kids memorable and the way he introduces the characters is something else that has this sort of real quality to it, where you kind of remember knowing kids for specific things when you were growing up with them. There's the kid where he says he was allowed to watch R-rated movies, and you could tell, and he's making like references to Platoon. And then he said there was the kid that probably has to go home soon, and then the kid says, "I probably have to go home soon." It's like, yeah, we knew that kid, like everybody knew that kid, and I love that sort of universal quality where it's like, I mean, I don't know so much now, but like I said, growing up in the '90s as opposed to the '80s, pretty much everything he was describing is something I felt like I remembered, and setting the story up like that, and it's like the idea where you can get nostalgia for an era that you were never in. Like there is a nostalgia quality to stuff you see in like A Christmas Story. I've talked about this with stuff like Grease and American Graffiti even, where you can feel nostalgia for an era that you were just never a part of, like not even close, like decades before you were born. But and how you can kind of have that same feeling where it's like even though it's in a different decade than you grew up in, it's still there's still a familiarity there that's like sticking, and to be able to kind of feel that on a more personal level might have. I don't know how much that was influencing the way I saw the rest of this movie. Like, this movie could have been absolute shit, but I don't know that I would completely notice, because it did such a good job of establishing the era and the characters and that familiarity and all that, and it actually feeling like somebody's memory, which is what the movie is. And as far as it being like how it's done visually, how the movie's made, there is some. They do take some stuff here, like the transitions sometimes can be really inspired. There's one in particular where he's at the dinner table, and then and obviously he's just in normal clothes because it's a normal dinner scene, and then it cuts back to him, and suddenly he's in like his winter clothes, and then he like falls back into the next scene, which is outside in the snow, and it's like that. That was a really kind of cool and inspired transition, and so stuff like that is going to continuously keep the movie alive because the movie's got so much energy like throughout it, like probably almost to a fault, but still it's almost like this kind of movie kind of requires that sort of energy, especially since everything it's already set up that everything is so exaggerated. So that I feel like it was doing well and establishing the idea of there is something that happens that's dark. It's not as dark as it could have been and not as dark as it's set up, but I did like the whole idea that it was basically setting up that like movies and stuff in the 80s got away with much darker shit than it is now. Like when you see PG now is basically what G was at one point. And like G is almost completely non-existent at this point. And so to actually have that moment where they kind of address that in a movie that I believe this movie is PG. So the idea that they took the extra meta approach of being a PG movie and had something dark happen in it and even make the joke like that's what the 80s were, you could do that in kids movies. And it's like that kind of thing I can really appreciate also. And stuff like even stuff like there's a point in this movie that just had me laughing hysterically, where it's set up, and then the payoff is Steve Zahn eventually punches an elf. And it's not something that has a lot of attention drawn to it. It's in like amidst chaos, and it's stuff like that. Like I was thinking, I don't know a kids movie recently where I would have seen Steve Zahn punch an elf. Like I feel like even that, like it's not a dark thing, but it's still something where I feel like I don't know how many PG movies I would see that in anymore even. Just Steve Zahn punching. I mean, that in itself is just great. Like, I'm really glad we have a movie now where Steve Zahn punches an elf. Like, that's something the world needed. So you can see the parts of me this movie was was pleasing. So it's yeah. So I was just kind of, it's one of those movies where like if you're into it early, you'll just kind of be into pretty much everything it's throwing at you, almost everything. There is stuff here where it's like I was talking about the exaggerated stuff. Where there's just these little details are really great. There's one particular moment where they're looking for a Cabbage Patch Kid for his sister. And the Cabbage Patch Kid, in this case, is essentially the Turbo Man doll, where it's like you just can't find it anywhere. Everything's off the shelves. And there's one moment where they go to a store in the mall, and they go down the Cabbage Patch aisle, and there's nothing, like the shelves are completely empty, and it's just a janitor, and there's a literal tumbleweed at his feet. And that visual is just so funny, and the way they just approached that whole exaggerated feel was doing this movie a lot of favors. And it's like that, taking that sort of style of humor with the energy that this movie's already got. It was just fun. I was just getting a lot of good vibes off of this movie, in a really surprising way. And like just the way they were, and the fact that the janitor starts to tell what is essentially a war story after that as to what was happening when the Cabbage Patch Kids all went away, which is great. And then talking about it kind of being like the Turbo Man doll, yeah, there is where David Cross essentially plays a better version of the Jim Belushi character in Jingle All the Way, which is very funny if you look up a story on YouTube that David Cross told about Jim Belushi. So the idea of him like bettering a role Belushi once did is very funny in itself, and maybe potentially an in-joke in itself. But the problem here, though, is that much as I love David Cross, his involvement here kind of propels us to a sort of climax. A climax that I don't particularly care for. Like, this is the kind of place where it's like the movie gets maybe a little too over-energized, and it starts to become another sort of typical kind of movie you would see these days. But there's one thing in particular, and this could just be a me thing, but the way this movie sort of leans into its gross out factor got to be a bit much. Like there's shit jokes galore first, like throughout it, but then there's the whole idea of projectile vomiting being somewhat of a plot point, I guess you could call it. It has some sort of payoff. And it goes on for a very, very, very long time. And I get that that's the joke, but I feel like when a movie is as creative as this movie is, and the way it handles its energy and actually puts it to good use, it feels especially cheap. To know that the makers of this movie seem to know what they're doing, that it feels like such a cop-out to lean into gross out as much as it does. So that was taking away kind of a lot of it for me when we got towards the end there. But for the most part, though, like I said, I like the episodic nature of it, and the idea that bringing in that whole thing of parents revolting against video games is a big factor in it. And how like it's bringing in all this stuff that you actually remember from real life into this really exaggerated story, And like I said, it gives it a real quality. And what's interesting about this also is the very end, where the whole movie has an emotional payoff. And it's like, in another case, this would be like, tonally, they wouldn't have earned it at all. But the fact that the movie does set up a real sort of base, that all this exaggerated stuff is built off of, where like underneath it all is stuff that you remember and like has this sort of all these personal connotations with. And it might seem a bit bogged down by all the gross out factor we had prior to it. But surprisingly, the ending really does work. And like when it actually does go down a sort of emotional path, and it turns out that the whole movie is essentially a love letter to one particular character. Really caught me by surprise, and it's genuinely kind of emotional, and like surprisingly pulls it off. Like it's like it's. I mean, I criticize all the gross out stuff and some of the more over the top stuff during the climax, but the fact that they were able to come back around and like get this ending and stick the landing on this ending, is very impressive. So yeah, so I was quite surprised by this. And it's actually a recent Christmas movie I might actually watch again, and I might actually recommend to people, which is crazy. Um, I don't know if it's gonna reach the classic status, because like I said, I can't even remember the last Christmas movie that did, sadly. But yeah, so just as far as a surprise factor, I would think I mean I could see this being really hated also, and maybe it'll be one of those things I'm in the minority on. I have no idea. At the time I watched it, and as I'm recording this now, it had like no reviews yet. So I don't know if that's because usually when they hold it back, from being reviewed is a bad sign. But it's I don't know. Maybe I'm just not seeing the stuff that's not working in it yet. Maybe I'm too blinded by that whole thing of, it's bringing back so many memories of my own, which is what the point of the movie is, because through that perspective of the main character. But yeah, it was just really working for me for the most part. So yeah. So let's end on the French Dispatch. And maybe it took me way too long to see. I feel like I've been looking out for it forever. Um, I will say just right away before I say anything, I was looking into it, and apparently this movie has a lot of journalistic references in it, that are gonna completely go over my head. So it's like I think the French Dispatch itself is based on something, and then a lot of the characters are based on they're like composites of real people. Like I know there's supposed to be like some James Baldwin and Jeffrey Wright's character and stuff like that, but other than that, that's the kind of stuff I'm not really I don't know enough about to really pick up on. So if I were to do like kind of a deep dive on that, I'm sure might appreciate this movie even more. But I'm already really, really, really appreciating it. So we'll see where it goes from here. But what's interesting about this is that obviously it's always an exciting time when a new Wes Anderson movie's coming out. And there's rarely ever a disappointment. I wasn't as into Isle of Dogs as I would have liked to have been, but like The Grand Budapest Hotel is one of my favorite movies of the last decade, and it just seems like he's getting the more he leans into himself and becomes more and more Wes Anderson-y. Like typically in that instance, like another director, the more they lean into themselves, you would think that it's like it would start to be a detriment to the quality. But I feel like just the more Wes Anderson becomes Wes Anderson, if this is the quality we can expect, that's a really be as Wes Anderson as you can possibly be, because this is like more and more with every project. I feel like he's just truly embracing it. Because I think the trouble here is that you risk falling into self-parody, but Wes Anderson is such a precise director and filmmaker that it's like we talked about before how it's crazy to think about how much thought goes into every single frame of a Wes Anderson movie, and how that comes through, and how you can see somebody that's that precise and knows their own work that well and their own style that well and has that much control over what they can do. The more you lean into that, only the better you can be, and I feel like this movie is proof of that. I still think Grand Budapest is my favorite Wes Anderson, but I mean, this is probably going to be a contender after multiple viewings, because the thing about it was I wasn't even sure I was into it at first. Like when we got the opening stuff and then we had like the Owen Wilson stuff, it was like, okay, yeah, it's, it's definitely a Wes Anderson movie, and it's like, okay, and it felt like it was kind of jumping around a little bit, and it was like, kind of hard to gauge where it was going to go and what it was going to do. And if it was gonna really work or not, and it's like, or if he had gotten a bit too much into, like, that was my fear. Is he leaning too much into himself, and is he becoming self-parody? But then there was about a turning point here because we've got what's essentially three stories with a couple of prologues and an epilogue. And when we got into this first story with Benicio del Toro, Adrian Brody, and Lea Seydoux, it was somewhere in this story where it was like, there's that point in a movie when it suddenly kind of clicks. And then you're like, okay, I see what's... And then from that point on, the movie has you. And that moment came. That moment being... we have the Benicio del Toro character, and then we get his backstory where he's played by Tony Revolori. And then there is a transition here that shows Tony Revolori, like... he literally hands the role back over to Del Toro, or Del Toro takes the role back physically on the screen, and that's the transition of the time jump. And it was pretty much at that point, it was like, oh, and then I suddenly was like zoned in on this movie until it was over. And it's like, all it takes is that one moment, and then a movie can have. And now it's like, when I think back on the Owen Wilson stuff and stuff like that, it's like, yeah, okay, I appreciate the whole package here. I get what it was doing now. And I immediately wanted to see it again, and I can't wait. Its Blu-ray release is like a month away, and it's probably going to be something I end up pre-ordering, because I really, really want to see this again. And so, yeah, on this story, well, first off, we do kind of have... the like, as far as like the story layers, how Grand Budapest started, where it was like Tom Wilkinson's grave, then it was Tom Wilkinson, then it was Jude Law, F. Murray Abraham, and so on. Where it kind of felt like it had those, not like in the time aspect necessarily, but just the sort of layers that the story was being told in, and how it was kind of unraveling from thing to thing to thing. So that was kind of grabbing me, but like I said, I wasn't quite sure I was there, but then during this first story, it really helped. And it might also put some people off. The going back and forth between black and white and color might seem like a bit of a gimmick. But I feel like those times where he, like, it's very, like I said, precise how he chose, like, when that was going to happen, and the particular moments, whether it be character or some event that's happening, kind of triggers it to go back and forth. It was all just starting to work for me, and that's what I was talking about with the last movie, where it's like, if a movie's just working for you in general, anything it throws at you, you're gonna be ready for. And it's like, yes, just give me more of you in general, movie. Just give me everything you have. And holy shit, is this the perfect movie to have that feeling, because it will throw anything. Like, you have no idea what the next thing is gonna be that it throws at you, but you are super ready for it. And everything is like the unpredictable nature of it, and it's not just, like, story wise, not like just events, but like the style. Like, eventually we break into animation from time to time, and while that might seem like, oh, maybe that's a little too much, every time I feel like every time it broke into animation, I was nearly on the floor laughing. Like, I was in physical pain. Like, my sides, my jaw, everything was just aching from laughing. Particularly, there's a chase sequence towards the end that's all animation, and I was just losing my fucking mind. It was so goddamn funny. And that's the thing about Wes Anderson movies also, is you can get so caught up in, like, just the craft of them in general, and how they look, and the production design, and how precise everything feels. And it's like, this is a filmmaker that puts so much into every single frame of his movies, and that's not even to mention that the movies are hilarious. The Grand Budapest Hotel was probably the funniest movie of the last decade, and it's, and like every time and it's still like it's one of those cases where not only is it just that funny the first time, it's almost like it gets funnier the more you get to know the movie, and it's more like the more familiar the characters become to you. So I can only imagine down the road, after I've seen this movie like 20 times, just how incredibly funny it's going to be, probably throughout. And it's and I just really love this. But like I said, it's also got really great, artistic qualities. Obviously, there's one in particular. There's a really great scene. It's the first scene of the Del Toro Lea Seydoux scene, where he's doing a nude painting of her, I guess you could call it, and it's just her posing. And there's this interaction between them with no dialogue whatsoever, and it almost made me feel like it was going to be like just a whole, like the whole Del Toro sequence is going to be silent. But it's just this first scene, but that whole thing in itself was just working so well. And then that's that thing is usually if something's really working well, you don't really want the vibe to break. But then the vibe does break when Adrian Brody comes into it. But then it's like whenever it breaks the vibe, that's only because it's going into another direction that will probably be even more entertaining, and it will just continue to build on itself. And that's pretty much what's going on throughout this whole movie, more or less. Talking about Adrian Brody's presence here, there one teaming I just forever love is Adrian Brody and Wes Anderson, especially after Grand Budapest, where you can see Grand Budapest and here, where Adrian Brody with Wes Anderson dialogue basically turns swearing into an art form. And it's and it's like I don't know if there is a funnier swearer than Adrian Brody in a Wes Anderson movie. And he really and it doesn't feel like he's just going back to Dimitri from that movie or anything like that. It just like all these characters are there, like everybody's in the Wes Anderson universe when they're a character in it. But and even though you can see they kind of did this in the other movie also, it's still like it still just feels rich with all these different characters, and I feel like it says something to that it feels like his cast just continued to grow and grow and grow. And it's like there's hardly anybody that's not in this movie. And everybody feels like that's. I feel like the only person that kind of got the shit into the stick was Christoph Waltz, who's only here for like 30 seconds and doesn't really have much of anything to do except just kind of be there. But everybody else, as big as this cast is, has some sort of significance or some sort of standout moment at least, which is really great. So to be able to balance all of that out, but not feel like overcrowded. Like it's like I was kind of interested where it's like this is going to be broken down into different stories, but the movie's not even 2 hours. How are they gonna? And with this big of a cast list, that's a lot to fit in. But you would never sense that there's some sort of issue with flow. Like it just flows perfectly, like any other movie that is this length would. While having all these characters and actors coming in and out of it, but leaving their stamp as they come and go. Often hilariously, and that's I just really love this. And then the whole idea of another thing that just completely killed me was the idea of like that whole idea of just embracing Wes Anderson and wanting him to be Wes Anderson without that ever getting old, because that's the case where like the way his style is, you could see it getting old quickly, but then and like I said, where he walks that line where he could be parody of himself, but there was a point in time where Edward Norton uses a hot air balloon as a getaway vehicle. And first off, that as soon as it cut to it, I once again completely lost my mind. And secondly, it's that whole thing of just like, is there a more Wes Anderson circumstance in the world than a hot air balloon being used as a getaway vehicle? I mean, just saying the words makes me makes me want to just curl into this ball of laughter all over again, like I did when I first saw it. And that, like I said, the way you can just embrace that, and how it never gets stale, and if anything, it just gets funnier the more he embraces himself. And I just feel like this movie almost just feels like a celebration of this movie feels like every Wes Anderson movie was leading to it. And I guess because you can go back like the Bottle Rocket and then Rushmore and Tenenbaums and on, and then you can see where it was kind of building and building, and he leans more and more into it every time. You can literally see the stepping stones, and it's like he's already got another one that's like in the works right now, and there's so much pressure on that movie following this one. To where, like, I want to try to back off that movie already. Because I can't imagine trying to top this movie. And of course you got the Desbois score, which we learned, like, he won his, when he won that Oscar for Grand Budapest, and it's like you really get the sense of Wes Anderson movies, especially these days, may not completely reach their point without those Desbois scores. And the way they just the way he is so in tune with his actors, but then the way they're also in tune, he and Desbois, it's like you can feel everything. Like, you can say it's a Wes Anderson movie from beginning to end, but it's like you can sense all these, cogs in this machine that are making it work. And how it's literally like a family. Like, even when, like, all the returning actors, like, once you're in a Wes Anderson movie, it's like you're basically Wes Anderson for life, which is amazing. Even with actors like Edward Norton, who have reputations for being hard to work with, and it's like once he was in Moonrise Kingdom, he's been here ever since. So it's like, it's once you're in a Wes Anderson movie, you're part of this family. I feel like the only person this movie was missing was Lucas Hedges. But and he may have even, I may have just missed him. I don't know. There's so many people in this, whether they be in the background or what, but they're there. Jason Schwartzman, who I kind of wish was more in the foreground of this one, because I feel like he could have had a character that really stood out in a movie like this, but, like, he certainly would have been the Chalamet character if this was made, like, back in the Rushmore days. But even so, it's, yeah, you just never know exactly which direction all of this is going to go, and what kind of surprise is going to sneak up on you. And I just, like, it's been a while since I've been so hooked on a movie as this, but that's what it is. Chalamet's just really hitting it out of the park this year. So, yeah, that's all I can say is I really can't wait to see this again. Because I'm sure I could go on and on and on even more about it. And to get to see more of the detail also, because you can't pick up everything in a Wes Anderson movie the first go around. It's impossible. So, I can't wait to see this again. So, yeah, it'd be nice if in our awards videos we could get back to it, but I don't know, because the year is very busy. But, we'll see what happens. But, if I had to pick, like an MVP of the cast, as hard as that might be, yeah, as great as this whole cast is, and the ensemble, just everybody's bringing everything, there's some clear standouts in Benicio del Toro and Jeffrey Wright. So I especially love what the two of them were doing. So, but Del Toro especially, because Del Toro was the one that kind of really, his performance is what really pulled me in and made me realize, like, oh, I think this is going to be something I love. And that's exactly what happened. So, yeah, you can pretty much always trust Benicio del Toro. I've never met him in my life. I'd probably trust Benicio del Toro with my life. So, you make incredible movies. You pull me into them. I'd probably trust you with my life. That's the way I work. So, that's just what this movie brought. I just really, really love this. So, that's the note we end on. Thank God. So, we're still doing this whole array of new releases. I finally saw Spencer, so we'll be talking about that, and just a whole bunch of other stuff. A lot of the awards movies. Mass is in there. I saw a whole bunch of new shit, so we'll be getting all that out, and, still, Eternals is still there, so we'll get that out as well, and, yeah, and we'll go from there, and then we'll probably get into our awards video, and all the stuff that I missed in October will come back around. We'll finish the Tremor stuff and stuff like that. So, until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.